Welcome to Without Regret, the podcast. This podcast is for people who are looking for inspiration to overcome obstacles in life and want to see that it is possible to live your best life and become successful, whatever that means to you, regardless of your circumstances. Hear from me and my guests as we share our stories of perseverance. My name is Tamara, and I'm the host of Without Regret, the podcast. Welcome to another episode of Without Regret, the podcast. I'm your host, Tamara Albrecht, and today we're delving into a topic that has remained in the shadows for far too long, the devastating impact of financial abuse. In our spotlight today is an extraordinary guest, an author who courageously penned a memoir that lays bare her personal journey through the tangled web of financial abuse. This powerful memoir not only recounts her story, but also uncovers the heart-wrenching truth about how, after leaving a thriving career in commercial film to raise her twins, her sense of self slowly eroded as her husband tightened his grip on their finances. But the tale takes an unexpected twist. Just as she mustered the strength to plan her exit from a 24-year marriage marked by control and manipulation, her husband faced a dire diagnosis: stage 4B esophageal cancer and a broken neck. Today, we'll journey through her memoir, a story that offers not just a personal narrative, but also profound insight into the often overlooked connection between domestic and financial abuse. Beyond the pages of her memoir, our guest's commitment to raising awareness shines through. She's currently in pre-production for a documentary titled I Know Why She Stayed, shedding a much-needed spotlight on the rarely discussed issue of financial abuse, one of the major barriers that trap countless women in toxic relationships. Her expertise stems from a deep passion to empower others with knowledge about the insidious nature of financial abuse and its inextricable link to domestic abuse. With meticulous research and an intimate understanding, she's poised to unravel the multifaceted nuances surrounding this crucial issue. Brace yourselves for an enlightening conversation that will challenge perceptions, educate hearts, and ignite change. Financial abuse may have thrived in the shadows, but today we're bringing it into the light. Please welcome my guest, Kasey Rogers.
So
how are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm sitting in front of this brightly colored map.
I see that.
And I can see it behind me, and I'm like, okay, what is this? Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I look forward to hearing your story and, most importantly, how you were able to overcome these many obstacles. Just remembering the little bit that I do know about your stories, sounds very tough. So, yeah.
It was a little challenging.
Challenging probably to reconcile some feelings, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why don't you tell us your story?
Sure. Well, my name is Kasey Rogers, and I have kind of I wouldn't say that it's a unique story. I think that a lot of women experience the things that I experience, but because of a certain series of events, it lends itself to kind of exposing a part of abuse that we don't talk about a lot, which is financial abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I had been married for 24 years. And the first 12 years of my marriage, my husband met, we were both in the film industry, and we moved to New York City. And I got a full-time job, and I had the benefits, and, I worked the steady, got the steady income. And my husband, who was a brilliant, director, producer, editor, writer, there wasn't anything creative that he couldn't do. He wanted to establish himself in the film industry, specifically in feature films. And he had a little money tucked away. So, I was like, go for it. But I didn't see a lot of the signs that kind of exhibited problems in our marriage early on. One of the things that happened was that we had I got pregnant. We got married, and he didn't tell his parents. He refused to tell his parents.
That you were married or having a child or both?
Uh, Both. And
Okay.
then I miscarried, and he refused to tell them that we had gotten married. So we ended up having a second wedding as though it was our first wedding. And that was really problematic because my parents and all of my friends knew we were married, but his side of the family didn't. And that set up a really, really wonky kind of pattern, like of lying and of deceit. And, he always said, oh, I'm the black sheep of the family. This is, like this will disgrace me. You know, there's no real need for them to know. But what it did was it really gave him an ability to kind of exert a lot of power over me. Um, so anyway, fast forward, we were married for about 12 years. I was still working in the commercial film industry and I was making a lot of money. I was working also on a pet project. Well, wasn't really a pet project. It was what I was really hoping would take off, but I was working on a musical and writing a musical. And we were living in New York City, and I got pretty far with it, all things considered. And his career wasn't really going anywhere, mostly because he couldn't play well with other children. So lots of things happened. His partner ended up embezzling from him, and he was just so distraught. He just couldn't go back to work. And meanwhile, part of our backdrop was I was commuting 2.5 hours each way into work. So our lifestyle was very different than most married couples because I had to catch a bus like at 5 o'clock in the morning to get into the city in time. And so we basically had kind of this, I don't know, honeymoon romance, like on the weekends, we'd go out to movies, would go to the antique stores, would work on our house. We had an old Victorian. So it wasn't really a realistic portrayal of how most married couples, interact with one another. But after about, I would say like 10 or 11 years, I mean, there were just some cracks. One of the things was he was very, very jealous of anybody that consumed any of my time. You are a bad wife, like those people are just using you. And, anytime we would go out with friends, it would erupt into an argument after they would leave. And he, like even something as simple as like I have a cooking background and making, Christmas presents with lots of baked goods. That's a waste of time. You shouldn't waste your time like that. But I didn't see any of that because I was in love.
That'll do it to you.
Yeah. So I was approaching my 40s and I was like, if we're going to have kids, we got to do it. We got to, this is serious. And he always was very, very reluctant to start a family. And the excuses were so pathetic. But what I finally figured out was the reason why he didn't want to start a family was because that meant that he had to be responsible. And up until now, I was the one that was making the income, paying the bills. He made a lot of money when he got a job in, but he didn't get that many jobs in. So he might work out of a year, he might have like 2 really, really big jobs that kept him busy for like maybe 2, 3, 4 months. But I was commuting into New York every single day. So there was a very uneven distribution of, chores and everything else. Like we always had somebody come in and clean the house because I was gone, but he was home. So I started to put my foot down because I was like, I wasn't happy in the marriage anymore. I was really, really discouraged. And he finally agreed that we could start a family. And I got pregnant when I was 41, and I had twins, a boy and a girl, when I was 42. Yay. And they are wonderful kids. But the moment I quit my job to stay home with them when they were about two, it was ridiculous. He finally got a full-time job as a copywriter for an ad agency in New Jersey. He was an hour to an hour and a half away. I was 2.5 hours away. A lot of times we wouldn't get home in time to get them from daycare before we started racking up fees. And it was like $50 for every half hour. And we had two kids in daycare. And I tried the nanny thing and I tried all these other solutions. But one day I came home and my son was sick and the babysitter hadn't been able to get in touch with me. And I was like, that's it. I'm done. I called work and I said, I quit. So that's when the real trouble started because I wasn't financing his lifestyle. And he started watching every penny. He, was appalled at the amount of money we spent on groceries. It's like, how dare you? It was like ridiculous stuff. He expected me to feed a family of four on $400 a month. And, like every class that I wanted the kids to get into, whether it was tumbling or swimming or whatever, it was like, we can't afford that. So things were not absolutely horrible, but there were a lot of times I just knew that things weren't right either. There were things that he just did that, like, I'll give you an example. Like one time we were traveling home to his folks' house for the holidays. And I wanted to take a shower the night before. And he was like, it's too late, like you're going to keep the kids awake. And I was like, all right, I'll take one in the morning. When I got up in the morning, no, it's too late. You can't do that now. I'm like, I've got to take a shower. I'll be like 5 minutes. No, we don't have time. And he threatened to take my purse. He had he had the money on him. He had the cell phone and he threatened to leave with the kids without me if I got to the shower. And he would do things like that were very, very upsetting and controlling.
Controlling, yeah.
Wildly controlling. So when the kids were about 6, I think they were 6 or 7, he lost his job due to no fault of his own. He was a very, very hard worker. But the company he was working for merged and he couldn't find a job because he was one of the last ones to go. So all of the other jobs had been kind of taken up. So he wanted us to sell our home in we had this beautiful old Victorian that we had restored for years. And he wanted to move to Canada because he was Canadian French. And we had had a vacation property up there at one point before the kids were born. And that was his lifelong dream. And I was like, whatever, because I was just so miserable at that point. I was kind of convinced that if we did that, and he wanted to start a business, and we had always worked really well together. So for me, it was kind of in a make it or break it situation. And instead of making it, it broke it. Because 4 months after we moved up there, he got a call from his old boss, who he had never told that we had moved to Canada and had assumed that we were still living where we were when he had been working with him. And he accepted a job back in the States, leaving me alone in Canada with twins and opening a new restaurant. So that was the expectation. The expectation was the kids and I couldn't move back to the States because we had spent all this money on renovating a property so that we could open up a restaurant, and we put all of this work into it. But he took a job back in the States because we couldn't afford, according to him, not to do that. So he was gone for almost 3 years out of our life. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because with him gone, I finally realized how much of a shell of myself I was.
Mm-hmm.
I had been walking on eggshells for years. Everything that I did upset him. It pissed him off. He had become very verbally abusive. You're not educated. I'm going to have to support you for the rest of your life. You don't know how to do anything. Just like all of these things that he used to say, your family is like horrible. And it wasn't that he attacked just the things that I did. He attacked me. He attacked my ethnicity. He attacked the way I drank my coffee. He, like my choice of foods, the music that I liked. Nothing that was me was acceptable any longer. And things finally kind of came to a head because, again, there was that family dynamic. His family was perfect. My family was horrible. And one night I got word that my father had died. And he was 93, and I had a contentious relationship with him for many years, but we had kind of smoothed it over, and I loved him. And my husband refused to allow me. He was up at that time because he had lost his job again, but that was like a very short-lived period. And so during that time, he was like, well, we can't afford to close the restaurant. And, this is what it takes to have a business. And, and I said, well, I'm going to call Sharon and Catherine, my 2 employees, and see if they'll cover. We can't afford that. Meanwhile, I knew that if something happened to his family, he would have been out the door in 5 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
But there was such a difference in the way that he expected me to react versus the way that he reacted. So fast forward a little while, he took another job back in the States. And all of a sudden, it was no longer acceptable for us to be living this very odd lifestyle where he was living down there and the twins and I were living up in Canada. And he started doing things like one day, he says, I overdrafted the account. Our checking account. The account was overdrafted, but it was overdrafted partially because he had not recorded a transaction. And I had checked the balance before I went to the grocery store to buy things for the business. But he decided he was going to put his foot down and he was going to close our bank account. And he opened up a new bank account without my name on it. This is the man that I had supported quite literally for 12 years. So he seemed to be manipulating the situation. There were red flags all over the place. He refused to pay for part of the mortgage, the insurance, anything related to the kids. Everything was my responsibility. I had screwed up. It was my fault that he had to work as hard as he did because I didn't, make enough money with the business. And it was such a line of BS because number one, I had started a catering business. I had like clients all over the place, but we also had tenants in the building that kept their windows open in the middle of winter, and their heating bills were like more than what I was collecting in rent. The city or the town that we lived in started construction in the middle of summer, our busiest season, right in front of my restaurant. So there were mitigating circumstances, but none of that was good. It was all my fault. I was just a horrible business person. And he was going to have to put his foot down, and we were going to sell the building and move back to the States. So I got an attorney, and she said, you know what? If you want to divorce, which at that point I decided this is the only course for me, she said, you have to go back to the States because it was a very messy situation.
Oh, I
So,
bet. Yeah.
yeah. So we moved back to the States, and my intention was to leave him, but I didn't have a job. And it was in the middle of the recession, or we were just coming out of the recession. I had no contacts where we had moved to. And he refused to do anything to help me get a job. He refused to get a phone, even a landline that would cost $12 a month. He insisted we could not afford, even though he was the artistic director or creative director for a major ad agency. He insisted we couldn't afford $12 a month. I had a computer that wouldn't charge because the input jack was broken. And I went out and I got this thing called a magic jack so I could make phone calls on my computer, but it didn't always work. How am I supposed to get a job if I can't even give them a phone number to call me back and I had no cell phone? I had a car that I was going back and forth because, we still had the property in Canada and I was moving things out. No, we can't afford to have it looked at by a repairman. I was driving around in a car that shouldn't have even been on the road. And a lot of times our kids were with me. So I was just really determined to leave. I tried to leave once because I was starting to feel endangered. He was just so erratic all the time. I knew his health, there were some health issues that he wasn't addressing. I didn't know how bad it was, but he kept a lot of that hidden from me. And I left once, I came back, and he did try. He tried to kind of stifle his impulses. And I think that I really scared him by leaving. And things were okay for a couple of months. And then at the end of February, well, actually, it was in the middle of February. Our birthdays were just a couple days apart. And he said, what do you want for your birthday this year? And I said, I want you to go to the doctor. I want you to find out why you can't swallow. And I can take care of myself, and he was like really, really livid. He didn't speak to me for days. So finally, I said, all right, if he's not going to go, I'm going to go. So I went to the doctors. We had the same doctor. And I said to her, I said, look, if I came to you as a patient and I had these symptoms and I said, what do you think is wrong with me? She said, you have to get him to go. Because she told me that one of her favorite professors had the same symptoms and he was dead 6 months later from esophageal cancer. So I finally convinced him to go and have some tests, but it didn't really seem like anything, really bad. Like it seemed like, okay, they'll give him some medication, something to allow him to swallow a little bit better. And he'll be fine. Because he looked great, he had lots of energy, whatever. And then I had finally got a job as a chef at a restaurant locally, which didn't pay great, but at least if I needed to leave him, I could, like if I had worked and put money away and whatever, I could get out. I had a path of escape and I had a plan. And the day that I got the job, the doctor, they called and said, like you have to come in. And he had the weekend before, he had experienced really, really severe neck pain. And we had ended up in the emergency room twice. And the pain was because there was a tumor that had eaten through his vertebrae. And he was literally walking around with a broken neck. Yeah. So it was a shit show. I hope I can say that.
No, yes, please. Yes, absolutely.
I swear like a trooper.
So do I, no problem.
Good. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. There were all these feelings of like, oh my God, I should have done more to protect him. I should have realized. I mean, I felt so guilty. I hated him. I loved him. I was so angry with him because here he was. They gave him 2 weeks to live. That was the diagnosis when we first went to the hospital. They said between the cancer and the extent of how much it had penetrated the rest of his system and the broken neck, he was goner. He didn't have any life insurance. He had refused to get out life insurance because he did not want me to profit from his death. So here I was raising twins, no job. I had a place in Canada that was running amok. I had somebody that had agreed to take it over, and bills weren't being paid, whatever. And he lasted from the initial diagnosis was at the end of March, actually it was beginning of April, and he lasted until October. And it was horrible because here he was, like in the quiet moments that we had together, nothing had changed. He would say and do things that just to this day, I just want to wring his neck. I mean, they were just so disturbing and awful. And I wasn't worthy of that kind of vehement behavior that, like I was horrible, I was going to hell from the way that I had treated him. He couldn't tell me what I did wrong, but,
Mm-hmm.
So he passes away and life didn't get any easier. I don't want to go into all the detail because it's almost worse than what I just explained. But most of the things that happened were related to really, really bad, like our finances going down. Like, I'll just give you one example. He was the victim of identity theft. So when I went to get our tax refund, I couldn't get it, which is what would have saved me financially because somebody had already collected the tax refund. And that happens with a lot of dead people, I guess. A lot, they scour these things and they, so that took me months. And when I started talking to some of my dear friends about what happened and what I experienced, it was like I was telling them that, it's what a lot of victims experience. Even though the victim is closest to them, the person victimizing them, the other person who maybe spends, like a very limited amount of time, thinks that they know them better and they can't possibly have been that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what would happen. And even with my close friends, I lost a lot of friendships over opening up. So I just shut down. I was living in the town that he grew up in because we had moved back so he could go to a better hospital in Massachusetts. So of course, anytime I went to make a friend or start a conversation, so what brought you back here? It's like, well, it's like, what are you going to say?
Mm-hmm.
I kept to myself. I just kept to myself. I couldn't go through the tears. I couldn't go through the explanations. And finally, one of the things that really saved me was I went back to school. I went back online. I was like, screw you. You say I'm not educated? I'm going to get my degree. So I did. And it was a really healing thing because even though I hadn't dealt with the trauma, I hadn't dealt with like all the financial things that I was dealing with, at least on a daily basis, I had something that I could do that brought me outside of myself. And I was going back for creative writing, which is, what I've always done. I've always been a writer. So, fast forward, we lived in this town where he grew up in until my kids graduated from high school. And then that was a nightmare because the moment they graduated, they lost Social Security. And we moved, and the guy that was renting, I bought a duplex with the help of his parents, who are always very lovely to me. And my tenant happened to have the same first name as my husband, but there should have been a sign. It should have been a sign. And he decided rent was optional. So it took me 3 years to get him out. And about 6 months after he got out and I had finished renovating, a pipe burst. And we were down to studs. And so now I was living in, I'm going to take a sip of my soda.
Yeah, no problem. I'll take a sip of my water.
So I decided being a landlord wasn't for me. And my kids who were in college, we moved them, we through insurance, we were able to renovate one side. And they live on one side, I live on the other, but we connected the two apartments so that we can go from place to place. And it's kind of like one big house, but they have a modicum of privacy, and so do I. Mm-hmm. Not as much as I want, though.
So this is the current situation that you're in right now. Okay.
But what really changed my life and how I recovered was when COVID hit. I had been teaching. I've had like a million different careers. And so I was teaching at an elementary school, and the school shut down because of COVID. And one day, one of the classes, I was working on my master's degree at the time. And one of my classmates for a nonfiction writing class, I had written an essay. And it was not about what I felt about my husband and all of the pain and anguish of the abuse. It was really about the medical system. I was so angry that he felt like he didn't have access to the medical system because he knew it, like he worked for a company, an ad agency. Their entire clientele were pharmaceutical people. Everybody thought he was a doctor. And he was well aware of how many people go bankrupt every year because of medical expenses. So he just kind of like pushed it aside and pushed it aside and pushed it aside.
He couldn't have done it in Canada, though. Isn't Canada universal healthcare?
But he was down here.
Yeah.
He was down.
He could have come back. He could have come back.
I know.
Yeah.
But part of it was his stubbornness, part of it was his ego. He didn't want to admit that, he couldn't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
So I sat down and I wrote a draft of a memoir based on the short story that I wrote for the nonfiction writing class when COVID hit, and putting those words on a page gave me a picture of my marriage that I might never have had. I mean, I used my journals. I used emails. I never delete emails. So back, and I'm like, what about this? Like, for an example, okay, so he told his sister, I have to tell you this one little thing. So I discovered the day I was leaving Canada, I discovered a notebook that he had left up there with all of his passwords to his email accounts and other things. So I went online into his email and I could see what he was telling everybody, what he was telling his sister, what he was telling his friends. He was lying through his teeth about everything. I blew through all of the money from the sale of our house, and, I'm a horrible business person, and I can't be trusted, and like all of these things. But because it was his sister, he assumed that she and I would never have this discussion because, of course, she would be protecting him.
Right.
So when I started re-examining all of our emails, and he told her things like that I had never contacted an immigration attorney. I had canceled checks to the guy. He had emails that he had sent to the guy, but I had never, I never got an attorney. So there were all these things that kind of came out. But the thing that emerged more than anything was the financial abuse. He would make me give him receipts if I went to the grocery store, or for, like, if he gave me $20 to put gas in the car, I couldn't siphon off $5 from that because he wanted a receipt to show that I put the $20 in. Again, this is the man that had full access to my bank account and my check throughout our marriage. So when I started to write this, at that point in my life, I had had nightmares almost every single night of him coming back. And the dreams were pretty much the same. They were always, he was alive. I was stunned that he was alive. Everybody else was stunned that he was alive, but he was there in my life. He wasn't contributing anything to my life. And I had to confront him about that. And sometimes it was very traumatic. I would wake up in a cold sweat. And other times it would be like, I'd just be there telling him to screw himself, But once I started writing about it, the nightmare started to go away because I was starting to put together the pieces of the puzzle that allowed me to step back and acknowledge, okay, I'm not a saint. I mean, there were things that I did wrong in the marriage, but I certainly wasn't the person that he tried to portray me to be. And he was gaslighting me. He was manipulating me. He was lying to other people. And I'm pretty sure he was a narcissist.
Yeah.
But I didn't have that vocabulary.
At the very least, he was extremely insecure.
Yes. Yeah. He was very insecure. I mean, there were telltale signs, but I didn't see any of them.
Yeah.
Until I started writing about it. So I wrote that, and I started talking to people that read the book. It's called Our Better Selves. And I started to talk to women that had read it, and they were like, oh my God, I went through the same thing. Or, oh, you can't believe what my husband did. He showed up at work one day and got me fired, because, he was being such a jerk. Or there were all of these things that tied into the financial aspect of abuse that I never saw. I never had heard the word financial abuse when it relates to, I kind of knew about elder abuse, somebody coming into a home and taking advantage of somebody that wasn't completely, in charge of their faculties or whatever. But I never understood how it related. And it's really what helped me survive and move forward. Like I have an initiative right now called I Know Why She Stayed. And the reason why I named it that is because when I was 12, we had moved from a very kind of comfortable lifestyle in a small town in Massachusetts to upstate New York, because my father had a midlife crisis and decided to go from being, like he worked at General Motors, and he was going to become a minister. So he went to Bible school. And the couple that lived on the other side of the duplex also went to Bible school. And every night we could hear the man beating the shit out of his very petite Korean wife who spoke no English and had 5 children. I used to always say, "Why doesn't she just leave him?"
Yeah.
It's like that was my understanding of the solution, until I realized that what keeps so many women, and this is proven by so much data, 99% of all abused women are also financially abused. The amount of, or the barriers that are put up to prevent a woman from leaving keeps her in the marriage. And so I finally understood it wasn't about wanting to stay. It wasn't about the fact that she wanted to be there. It was about the fact that she didn't have the resources to leave. And so I started the initiative, but the whole idea of it is also to bring one component that a lot of people miss when they're dealing with domestic abuse. There are all sorts of like organizations that only deal with domestic violence and helping somebody survive and having somebody recover from what they've experienced. There are also organizations out there like the Purple Purse that, see purple, that help women understand financial abuse and financial literacy. But what they don't understand and what they don't do is they're not preventing domestic abuse because they're not addressing the systemic reason why most women cannot escape, which is that as a society, we are financially abused by the gender wage gap. When a woman makes 80 cents on a dollar, and it's even worse for women of color, Hispanic women, sometimes it's 60 to 70 cents on a dollar. Those are wages that they should have in their paycheck that they're being denied. We have to confront the pink tax. The pink tax. So, just for your listeners, we pay more money for, products that are identical to men's products, but because they're pink and they're labeled for women, we pay more money.
Yep.
We also pay taxes on feminine products.
Yes.
Men, or I should say, non-custodial parents, let's put that out there, are in arrears in a single year, $218 billion. So that's money that women can't use for paying for childcare to have a better job than being, like in a low wage job that maybe they have some flexibility. And if you look at 80 cents on a dollar, it's like, it's only 20 cents, big deal. But that 80 cents on a dollar on a monthly basis, well, I should say on an annual basis, it adds up to $12,000. So on a monthly basis, that $1,000 a month could pay for childcare, extra groceries, God forbid, a vacation, or or an emergency. But when you collectively take all of the women that are being systemically abused by not having an equal paycheck, it's I think the figure is $12 trillion annually.
Wow.
So that, and these are figures that are well known. The problem is that over in England, they were tackling this about 10 years ago. And their house, like, I don't remember what the
Parliament.
Yeah, the parliament. They were all up in arms. It was like, this is going to be the downfall of capitalism, or whatever. But they like I would listen to these things, and they were like, in an uproar. It's like, this is gonna unseat our way of life, and it's horrible and whatever. Nothing ever happened when they tackled this project. Like, I'm not saying that they don't still have issues, but not the kind of issues that were predicted. But the reason why you have people out there that don't want to support women having childcare, that don't want to, give family leave, they don't want to do all of these things that would support women's equality, is because it's a way for the patriarchy to maintain control. How do you maintain control? You maintain control by having so much more money than other people that you can basically buy the politicians that are going to vote for things the way that you want them to vote. And so I started an initiative.
Okay.
And I'm working with another woman out in the West Coast, and she's absolutely amazing. But we've both been through the ringer financially, and we're trying to get it off the ground. We haven't really launched it yet. We kind of had a soft launch, but we're trying to get more people on board to help us, so that I see this as the next step to the Me Too movement, where there were so many women that had experienced the same thing, but they never talked about it. And until they started talking about it, then things, things never would have changed. And I think that's what we need to do when we see all of these underpinnings of women losing their rights. Last year, I published a novel that deals with the same issues. It's called The Color of Frost, and it's very well written, by the way. It's a great story, but it deals with all of these same issues. It's set in 1974, right after Roe v. Wade was passed. But before, do you realize in 1974, a woman couldn't walk into a bank and get a credit card?
Yeah, I am aware of that.
Yeah. Most women aren't. I was just talking to a woman who is my age, 24. No. I was just talking to her, and she was like, that's right. It's like we forget all of these things that, like, have advanced, and all of these rights that we've slowly inched past, that have made women before then weren't allowed to get admitted into so many programs in college. The reason why women started to be able to go to med school was because of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Because the men that were over there weren't filling the seats, and so they started letting women into the program. But we've forgotten that was only 50 years ago.
Yeah.
In that same year, this is the 60th anniversary, the year of the Equal Pay Act that JFK signed back on June 10th of 1963. And where are we? We've inched a couple notches ahead. But when you consider inflation and everything else, it's pretty minuscule. So what my goal is yes, I want to educate women. I want women to understand the impact, and other people to understand the impact of financial trauma. I want them to get financial literacy education. I want them to understand the impact of, finances on abuse. But the most important thing is to close the door, so that if because there are a lot of women who were like me that had never heard about financial abuse, never understood the dynamic, that they can say, aha, if I see these warning signs, I know that I might be falling into a trap. If the man behaves like this with money, might not be a good idea to open up that joint bank, checking account. I should keep some money separate so that if something happens, I have something to fall back on. There are so many steps that could be taken to prevent what happened to me happening to other people. And that's the approach of what I want to do with I Know Why She Stayed. I want to open up I want the sunlight to be on these issues so that other women don't have to experience. I mean, what I experienced, unfortunately, was gut-wrenching. I mean, it's like sometimes when I'm at a point where it's like it happened to somebody else. It really is. It's like, that poor baby. It's like, it's almost like it didn't happen to me because it didn't happen to me because I'm a totally different person than I was then. It's like I've healed, I've recovered, I went from survivor to thriver. But there are so many other women that haven't. But there are also all these young women or women that are kind of like, that doesn't seem right. And
yeah, they're not seeing all the red flags yet.
Yeah. So
how do you reach that person besides coming on this podcast?
So
because, hopefully the people listening to this podcast are the people that know they need to overcome something and are looking for ways to do that. So how do you reach that person that may not realize it yet?
So what Kat and I have been doing is we've put together the book, Our Better Selves from Secrets. It's called Our Better Selves from Secrets and Lies to Healing and Forgiveness. I am the poster child of financial abuse. So my story, because it's very compelling, has a lot of insight into what a financially abused woman looks like. So what we're doing is we're creating a second edition of my book, and we're doing a reader's guide. We're doing a workbook, and we're approaching like financial institutions. Like I just had a meeting with somebody from the United Way to try to get some support outside of Kat and I trying to, finance all of these little things ourselves.
Yeah.
But we have a campaign. We have a way that you can donate. Like we don't have all of the stuff done. I've been working on a program for financial literacy so that it shows right now. Okay, you're going to laugh, but now my job, I went from teaching, and my job right now is I am the financial director of a nonprofit. So
okay.
So I do have like a kind of a background, and the way that people can help or the way that people can get more information is on my website. It's KaseyRogers.com, Kasey with a K, Rogers no D, and there's a button. Like a link there to the I Know Why She Stayed pages. And what we're looking to do, the thing that would help us more than anything is telling your story, like giving us permission, even anonymously, if you've experienced some of the things that we've experienced, because it's just like the Me Too movement. Once women started talking about this and started identifying it, then the floodgates opened because it was, oh
yeah.
So I have very high hopes for it because I have made some inroads. It's slow going because there's only two of us trying to have this massive thing, but
and work a full-time job, right?
Yeah, I work I work 3 part-time jobs.
Okay. Yeah.
I work at the nonprofit part-time, and I do like voiceovers and
Oh,
audio,
yeah.
and then I do like all these other things just so that I have the flexibility to keep writing because that's my passion.
Hmm.
And like I said, I'm really good at it. So
I believe you, but I'm not going to take your word for it. I'm going to have to
okay,
read your book.
okay. It's good. It's good. It's yeah, and that's why I write, and thank God I write because I don't know if I ever would have come to this place in my life if I had not sat down that one day and said, I'm going to put this on paper, you know? And I mean, most writers write like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 words on a daily basis if they're working on a project steadily. I sat down in one day and I wrote 30,000 words. I just vomited on the page because I had so much anguish, fear, loathing. I mean, you name it, the whole gamut of emotions that I hadn't confronted, that I had buried, that it was like, I'm not going to think about what happened. I'm not going to, you know, I'm just not going to think about it. I'm just going to push it aside. But it was eating me up inside. You know, like anytime anything would happen, I would be in tears and I would be like hiding. So
What was the biggest challenge for you, would you say, or the biggest thing you I don't know if the word struggle is the right word, but after he initially passed, what do you think your biggest conflict was? I mean, I can imagine how that might feel. Relief, probably, right? Guilt for feeling relieved.
yeah.
Um, freedom,
Hmm.
anguish, because your partner that you'd been with for 25 years was now no longer there.
Hmm.
Your financial situation that he left you in.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I can imagine you felt all of those things, but what was the one that you struggled with the most?
The thing that I struggled with the most was that I didn't care whether I lived or died anymore. The only thing that kept me going were my kids. You know, like knowing that they had just lost their father, that they had no relationship with him because, you know, he was gone so much of their life, and that I couldn't step away from my pain and anguish because I had these 2 kids that had no one else to rely on them, you know, to rely on. And there were times that, you know, like I was so lonely because like I said, my friends didn't want to talk about it. It
Hmm.
was they didn't believe me. It was like I was I it was almost like I was excommunicated, that, you know, I had these close friends for years and years and years that were my friends that just did not believe what I had to say. And the loneliness that I encountered just started making me sink further and further into depression. And depression leads to anxiety and all these other things. And I had nobody to talk to about it. Um, and that was really, really hard. I mean, I remember we had a couple of you know that expression, if you didn't have bad luck, you'd have no luck at all.
Yes.
Happened to me for a while, and there were all these like really, really stupid things that happened. But we had to move out of the first place that we found. And and I remember making a contact with this woman, and I didn't know how to act anymore. I didn't know how to be with somebody else other than my kids. It was just, it had become so foreign to have a conversation because I was just so shut down. And again, I was living in his town. Who was I
Mm-hmm.
going to talk to? So
Mm-hmm.
that was, I think, the most difficult thing, that I was constantly confronting a
How old
desire.
were, I'm
Hmm?
sorry, how old were your children at this time?
They were 13 when he passed away,
Okay.
so they were like in their teens.
Yeah.
And they were struggling too.
Yeah.
My son, when we owned the cafe, we named the restaurant after them because we always called them the Two Beans, and that really was fitting for a cafe, that's old coffee. So he was the belle of the ball. Like, all the kids would come over to the restaurant at the end of, um, you know, like the day after school or whatever on the weekend. And, he had this great network of friends to this day. I mean, he has friends, he's recovered, but he's not been the same. He's never been the child that I knew that was so effervescent and outgoing. My daughter, however, has completely blossomed. She's like, but I think part of it is when she went to college, she lived in the dorms.
Mm-hmm.
She lived on campus, and I think that really helped her to kind of get away and go outside herself. But seeing them and what they went through, and that was really, really hard. It was heartbreaking to see these kids that didn't deserve. He was not. I don't know. This is really weird to talk about, but I don't know if what he said about them would qualify as abuse. I don't think he ever said anything in front of them, but he certainly said things to me about them that gave me the impression he wasn't proud of them. And he would make comments like, he always compared them to my niece, who is a lovely person and I love her dearly, but they grew up totally differently. So confronting those things after he died and seeing these two kids struggle, and my son, like all he wanted to do was be invisible. He would walk through the corridors of school, and if I caught a glimpse of him when I would, go to meetings or something um, about them, he would be like, you knew he wanted to be invisible. He didn't want
Mm-hmm.
anybody to see him. So that was really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
That
So where did the strength to continue on come from for you?
my love of my children, it
Yeah.
really did. It was like, maybe it's because I was an older mom when I had them. And by the time I did have them, I just wanted them so desperately.
Yeah.
And I know every mom says this, but they're the best.
Yeah.
They're lovely human beings. They really are. They've blossomed, and they're just, they're just stellar humans. They have kind hearts. They're generous and loving. And I'm so lucky that they got through this. And it was, they like in the forward in my book, I tell them that, they inspired me, and they did. They inspired me to rise above thinking of myself as that person that he tried to define me to be. He
Mm-hmm.
obviously, I mean, and there were times, it's not funny, but it's odd because there were times that he used to praise me to everybody, but that was always in front of somebody else.
Right. Yeah.
Oh my God, she's such a great cook. Can you believe how wonderful she is? And, oh, her play's going to end up in Broadway. And, he used to like,
That's why people didn't believe you.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So those were the really, really hard years. And then
I don't want to tell you that you're wrong. And I'm not. I am absolutely not saying you are wrong. But I think there was a strength in you prior to having your children.
Yeah.
I believe wholeheartedly your children were the driving force and motivation. I don't know if that's really where your actual strength came from. Because I feel like my daughter is also my strength, or not my strength, but my motivation to do better. And, but my strength comes from my mother.
Yeah.
And the example that she gave me by who knows where her strength came from. Well, she tells me in one of these episodes, but she says God, I think. But she struggled significantly when I was growing up. So seeing her just work hard and just push through is where my strength comes from. So just something to think about that, I think your kids were definitely your motivation, and maybe they absolutely are your strength. I don't doubt that, but I just do think that there's probably something deeper.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really, really good point. And, part of going through what I went through leaves me sometimes with like, I can't necessarily always identify things within myself that are positive because I just, like there's that thing that I'm still trying to overcome that those negativities. So being strong is a wonderful attribute. So when people describe someone that's been in these situations in a positive manner, they might accept the compliment or they might accept it as being true at face value, but deep down inside it's kind of like it's that imposter syndrome.
Yes, I'm very familiar with imposter syndrome. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's that, oh well, maybe that's the way I project myself, but it certainly isn't the way that I feel inside about it.
Inside.
Yeah. So, but I'm getting there.
Yeah, good.
That's the big thing.
Because I see a whole lot of strength.
Yeah.
In what you've been able to accomplish.
Yeah. 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 I hope I live to 100 because I have a lot more.
I feel you, sister. I feel you.
Yeah. So it's all good though. It's good stuff. And I don't want to be like Mary Sunshine or whatever, but I really feel like what I experienced really gives me motivation to get out there and talk about it. And I've done a number of speaking engagements and talking about this, like, women just open up and it's like, oh my God, like let the healing begin. Because it's, again, it's all kind of wacky, but that's
life is wacky.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. And I don't want to say that I want to be an example because nobody wants to go through some of the things I've been through, but I want to give women a voice. I want to give them an opportunity to tell their story. And I work with a lot of writers doing memoir. And as a matter of fact, I'm finishing up what's called a developmental edit with a woman who experienced a totally different kind of abuse in her marriage. But getting it all down on paper really, really helps.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So writing and going back to school were kind of your two, like,
yeah.
that really, really helped you. Well, I want to close. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I want to thank you so much for being on here and ask if you have any last words, any words of wisdom, advice that you would, what's the number one thing you would tell somebody who's in an abusive situation, or if you want to share about your movement,
Okay.
Whatever you want to share.
Sure. I'd rather share about the movement just because there's so much on there that really I think could inspire people.
Okay.
So it's called I Know Why She Stayed, and you can find out more information about it on my website, where you can also buy my books. But to me, the biggest driving factor for having a website at this point is the initiative. I Know Why She Stayed. There's a little tab, and we are looking for people to help support us, whether it's financially or by word of mouth, or getting involved with helping us. Movements are really hard to start, but once they get a hold on the psyche of enough people, then they just have such a rippling effect. So I'm just really hoping that years from now, I can look back and I can say that what we're doing has changed the lives of so many people because they understand why somebody stays in an abusive relationship, that there are barriers, and those components between domestic abuse, financial abuse, and the gender wage gap are all tied together. So,
okay. All right. And the website one more time is KaseyRogers.com. Okay. And that's Kasey with a K and Rogers with no D.
Right.
And we'll put this, I'll put it on the show notes and all that stuff too, with links on my blog and website and everything too. So people will be able to go there and find it.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, you too.
If you or someone you know is suffering from domestic abuse, whether that's financial abuse or otherwise, help is available. Please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. If you're worried about your internet being monitored, you can give them a call at 1-800-799-7233. Thank you, and please stay safe. I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in to Without Regret, the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to ask you to please like and subscribe. Leave me a review wherever you get your podcast. That would be really awesome because that's how my podcast is going to get noticed. So that would be a huge help, or share it on your social media would be awesome as well. Thank you so much. This podcast is a Without Regret production, which is produced by me. Artwork is by me. Everything's by me except for that theme song. That's by a guy named Michael Bruguglio. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Without Regret Podcast, and on Instagram at without_regret_podcast. Thanks again.